I want to start by saying that I am 71 years old. I have buried a wife and a hunting dog and a best friend, and I have never once been the kind of man who loses his nerve over shadows or strange noises in the dark, because I spent 34 years walking through some of the deepest, most unforgiving wilderness this country has to offer, and I knew every sound those woods made the way a father knows the breathing of his sleeping children. And what I am about to tell you is the reason I handed in my badge 11 years early, drove my truck down out of those mountains, and have not set a single foot past a tree line since the autumn of 2003. My name is Harlan Moss, and I was a wilderness ranger for the U.S. Forest Service in the Ouachita National Forest of western Arkansas, a territory so dense and so old that the trees themselves seem to have personalities, where the ridgelines disappear into fog for weeks at a time, and the hollows between them stay so dark at noon that you need a flashlight to read your own map. And I loved every acre of it with the kind of devotion most men reserve for religion or a good woman, which is probably why it broke something inside me the night it turned on me. The summer of 2003 had been dry, brutally, record-breakingly dry, and the creek beds had cracked open like old leather, and the deer were moving strange, and the whole forest smelled like something waiting to combust. And it was during a routine fire watch patrol in late September, when the first cold front was just beginning to push down from the north, that I first noticed the cairns. They were stacked stones, river rocks mostly, balanced in columns of 4 and 5 along the Eastern Ridge Trail that I had walked no fewer than 200 times in my career. And I want to be clear that cairns in the backcountry are not unusual. Hikers make them as trail markers, as little monuments to themselves, and I had seen thousands of them over the decades. But these were different in a way I could not articulate on paper even if I tried. Because they were not placed on the trail or beside it the way a hiker would leave them. They were placed in the spaces between the trees, sometimes 15 or 20 feet off the path, in spots where there was no logical reason for a human being to be standing. And they were perfectly, almost obsessively, level, as if whoever built them had brought a carpenter's level along into the wilderness to make sure every stone sat at an exact horizontal plane. I counted 9 of them over a stretch of about 2 miles that first day, took photographs, logged them in my field notes, and told myself it was probably a survey team or some eccentric trail artist, because the human mind is a powerful machine for manufacturing reasonable explanations when the unreasonable one is sitting right there in front of you, waiting to be acknowledged. The second time I noticed something wrong, it was a sound, or more accurately, it was the absence of sound, which any experienced woodsman will tell you is far more alarming than any noise the forest can produce, because a quiet forest is a frightened forest, and a frightened forest means something in it is frightening everything else. And when I stopped on the trail around mile marker 7 on an overcast Thursday morning and realized that I had not heard a single bird call in over 40 minutes of walking, not a woodpecker, not a crow, not so much as a sparrow, my hand went to my radio before I even consciously decided to reach for it. I radioed my check-in with dispatch, told them my location, said everything was fine, and kept walking, because I was Harlan Moss and 34 years of these woods had made me more stubborn than afraid. And I walked another mile in that eerie, pressing silence until I came to the old fire lookout tower at the top of Shepherd's Ridge, a rusted steel structure built in the 1940s that hadn't been staffed since the late 80s, and I climbed it the way I always did on this patrol loop. All 92 steps up to the cab at the top, where I pulled out my binoculars and began scanning the canopy below. And that is when I saw the figure standing in the clearing at the base of the eastern slope, maybe a quarter mile away, perfectly still, facing the tower. Now I want you to understand the geometry of what I am describing, because it matters. The clearing at the base of that slope was accessible only by a trail that had been officially closed for 2 seasons due to washout damage. A trail I had personally posted with closure signs, and the figure standing in it was not moving, not swaying, not shifting weight, not doing any of the small unconscious things a living body does when it stands still. And it was facing me with the kind of absolute, unblinking orientation that made the hair on my forearm stand up under my shirt. Because even at a quarter mile through binoculars, something about the proportions of it looked wrong in a way I still cannot fully describe, as if the limbs were just slightly too long and the head just slightly too large, and the whole silhouette just slightly off from what a human being is supposed to look like when it stands against a line of trees. I called out over the loudspeaker mounted on the tower cab, identified myself as a federal officer, told the figure the area was closed, told them to please identify themselves and proceed to the nearest open trail. And the figure did not move, did not respond. And then, between one breath and the next, was simply gone, not walking away, not stepping into the tree line, just no longer present in the clearing the way a candle flame is no longer present after you blow it out. I sat in that tower cab for a long time before I climbed back down. Over the following 3 weeks, I found 14 more cairns. I lost radio contact in 2 locations where I had always had reliable signal. I found a section of trail where the bark on every tree for 100 yards had been stripped from the north-facing side at roughly chest height. And I found the bones, or what I assumed were animal bones at first, scattered in a rough circle around the base of a massive white oak at least 4 centuries old, arranged with the same eerie deliberateness as the cairns, each fragment pointing outward from the tree like the spokes of a wheel. And when I crouched down to look more closely, I saw that some of them were too large for any animal native to the Ouachita Range, too dense and too pale. And I stood up very quickly and walked away very fast and did not add them to my field notes. Because there are moments in a long career in the wilderness when your professional training and your deep animal instinct point in exactly opposite directions. And every single cell in my body was voting to leave. The last night happened on October 14th, when I was doing an overnight patrol because we had a suspected arsonist working the Southern District, and the fire danger was still extreme. And I had set up my camp at the designated backcountry site near Cutler Creek, a place I had slept at maybe 40 times over the years, as familiar to me as my own kitchen. And I woke up at approximately 2:15 in the morning because something was standing outside my tent. I know it was standing there because I could hear its breathing, slow, deliberate, and just slightly too rhythmic to be natural. The way a person breathes when they are consciously controlling their breath, rather than letting their body do it automatically. And I could see the shadow of it against the tent wall in the moonlight. A tall shadow with those same wrong proportions I had seen through the binoculars at the tower. And I lay in my sleeping bag for what felt like an hour but was probably 3 minutes, holding my breath. One hand on my flashlight and one hand on the bear spray clipped to my bag, and then the breathing stopped, and the shadow changed. And what I saw projected against that thin nylon wall was not a standing figure anymore but something on all fours, moving in a slow circle around the tent, and the sound it made as it moved was not footsteps. It was something softer and more deliberate, like dragging, and every few seconds it would pause and the breathing would start again, right up against the fabric, close enough that I could feel the warmth of it. I did not open the tent, and I am not ashamed to tell you that the reason I did not open the tent is that I was more afraid in those 20 minutes than I had ever been in my entire life. Afraid with a totality that bypassed reason and pride and 34 years of experience, and went straight down to the oldest, most primitive part of me, the part that is still just a small creature in the dark trying not to be found. And whatever was outside that tent felt like the thing that small creature had been afraid of since before it knew what fear was. When the light came, it was gone, and I broke down my camp in 10 minutes flat and walked 6 miles to the trailhead without stopping and drove straight to the district office and put my paperwork in that same day. And my supervisor asked me if I was all right, and I told him I was fine, and that I just felt it was time, which was both a lie and the truest thing I have ever said. I have never told this story to anyone but my daughter, who believed me completely, and a therapist who did not. And now I am telling it to strangers on the internet at 2 in the morning, because I just turned 71, and I can feel the end of things the way you can feel a storm coming before the sky shows you anything. And I want it written down somewhere that what I experienced was real, that the forest knows things we do not know. That there are places in this country so old and so deep that something has been living in them since long before we had a word for what it is. And whatever it was that circled my tent that night on Cutler Creek, I do not believe it meant to hurt me, because if it had meant to hurt me, the tent would not have been enough to stop it. I think it just wanted me to know it was there. I think it had been trying to tell me all summer. I think about those cairns sometimes, perfectly level in the dark between the trees, and I wonder if they were warnings or welcomes, and I have decided, after 11 years of thinking about it, that I am genuinely not sure there is a difference. I am not going to respond to the comments telling me this was a bear or a person or a hallucination from dehydration, because I have seen bears and I have met people and I have been dehydrated in the field, and I know the difference, and I am too old to be polite about it anymore. To the ranger who messaged me saying they work the same district and have seen the cairns, please stay safe. Please check in with dispatch more than you think you need to. And please, whatever you do, do not go to the old lookout tower alone at night. I have been trying to write this post for 3 weeks now, deleting it and starting over every single time, because every time I get to the part where it spoke to me, where it actually opened whatever it had instead of a mouth and said my name in a voice that was almost right, my hands start shaking so badly that I can't hit the keys accurately. But tonight I am going to finish it even if it takes me until sunrise. Because I need people to know what is out there on the Appalachian Trail between Ouachita and Cold Spring Shelter in North Carolina. And I need someone to believe me before I talk myself out of believing it too. My name is Declan. I'm 23, and I have been section hiking the AT since I was 19 years old, which means I have logged somewhere north of 800 trail miles across 6 states, sleeping in shelters and lean-tos, and under nothing but a tarp in weather that would make most people cancel their camping trip entirely. And I tell you this not to brag, but to establish that I am not the kind of person who panics at noises in the woods, who mistakes a bear for a monster or a screech owl for something supernatural, because I have heard and seen nearly everything these trails have to offer, and I have always been able to explain it, until the second week of this past May, when something followed me for 11 miles through the Ouachita National Forest, and I ran the last 4 of them in the dark. I had set out from Ouachita Shelter on a Tuesday morning, solo as usual, with a 5-day resupply in my pack, and a plan to make Cold Spring by early afternoon and maybe push another 4 miles to the next water source before setting up camp. And the morning was perfect in the way that only early May in the southern Appalachians can be perfect, with the rhododendron just starting to bloom along the ridgeline and the air tasting like cold water and pine resin. And I was maybe 2 miles out from the shelter when I first noticed the sound behind me. It was footsteps, and before you say it, yes, I know the AT is a public trail and footsteps behind you mean another hiker, and that was exactly what I told myself as I turned around and saw nothing, no one. Just the trail curving back into the trees 30 feet behind me, empty and still. And I stood there for a moment listening and heard nothing, and turned back around and kept walking, because the woods make sounds and your brain makes patterns, and that is just how it goes. The second time I heard it, I was descending a steep switchback section maybe a mile further on, a rocky technical stretch where you have to watch your footing or roll an ankle. And the sound this time was not just footsteps. It was the sound of something large moving through the brush parallel to the trail, keeping pace with me through the rhododendron thicket to my left, maybe 15 feet off the path. And I could hear branches bending and leaves compressing under weight and the specific wet snap of a green stem breaking. And I stopped dead in the middle of the switchback and said hello, in a voice that came out steadier than I felt, and the movement in the thicket stopped instantly, like a switch being thrown, and the silence that followed was so complete and so sudden that it felt deliberate, felt chosen, felt like something deciding to be quiet rather than something that had simply stopped moving. I kept walking. I walked faster. By mile 5, I had convinced myself it was a black bear shadowing me out of curiosity, which they do sometimes in spring when they're hungry and everything is a potential food source. And I had my bear spray unclipped and in my hand, and I was making noise the way you're supposed to, calling out every couple of minutes. And I had almost fully talked myself down from the ledge of genuine fear when I stopped at a creek, crossing to filter water, and looked up at the opposite bank and saw the print in the mud at the water's edge. It was not a bear print, and it was not a human footprint, and it was not anything I could identify from 4 years of wilderness experience. And what I can tell you about it is this. It was roughly the size and general shape of a human foot, long and narrow, with 5 toe impressions at the front. But the toes were too long, each one tapering to a distinct point rather than a rounded pad. And the arch of the print was so dramatically high that only the heel and the ball of the foot had made contact with the mud. And the depth of the impression suggested something that weighed considerably more than its foot size implied. And there was a second print 6 inches behind the first that told me whatever made them was not walking the way a person walks. The stride was wrong, the weight distribution was wrong, and the 2 prints together suggested something that moved in a low, forward-leaning crouch rather than upright. I stood up, and that is when I heard it breathe. It was on my side of the creek, behind me and to the right, no more than 20 feet away in the hemlocks, and the breath was long and slow and nasal, like something that had been holding very still for a long time and had just decided it no longer needed to. And I turned around in one fast motion with the bear spray raised, and I saw it. I saw it for maybe 2 full seconds before it moved. And what I saw was tall and pale and crouching behind a hemlock trunk that was not wide enough to hide it completely, with arms that were too long folded against its body, and a head that was tilted at an angle that made my stomach drop, tilted the way a curious dog tilts its head but taken about 30 degrees too far. And its eyes, and I need you to understand that I am not embellishing this, I am reporting exactly what I saw. Its eyes were pale and wide, and there was no pupil that I could distinguish, just 2 flat circles of the lightest gray I have ever seen on a living thing, reflecting the afternoon light from between the hemlock branches. I hit the bear spray trigger. The cloud of capsaicin hit the hemlocks, and I was already moving, scrambling back across the creek rocks without caring about wet boots, and I heard behind me a sound that was not pain and was not anger, but was something that I can only describe as surprise, a short, sharp exhalation that was almost recognizable as the sound a person makes when something unexpected happens to them. And then I heard it coming through the underbrush after me, and I ran. I want to be really honest about what the next 40 minutes felt like, because I don't want to make it sound cinematic or heroic, because it was neither of those things. It was pure animal terror, legs pumping on autopilot while my thinking brain sat somewhere in the back of my skull completely offline, and I could hear it behind me the whole time. Not fast, never breaking into what sounded like a full sprint, just moving at whatever pace it needed to move at to keep me in range. Crashing through brush when I crashed through brush, going quiet on the flat sections where I could run hard, and every time I thought I had put some distance between us, I would slow down just enough to hear it, still there, still coming, patient in a way that felt worse than if it had been chasing me at full speed. I had maybe a mile left to the cold spring shelter when it spoke. I do not know how else to say this, so I am just going to say it plainly. It said my name in a voice that was built from the right components, the right pitch, the right cadence, something close to the right accent, but assembled incorrectly. The way a song sounds wrong when someone who has only read the sheet music but never heard it performed tries to sing it for the first time. Technically note perfect and completely, deeply wrong. And it said Declan from somewhere in the dark trees to my left, maybe 30 feet off the trail. and I made a sound that I am not proud of and ran faster than I have ever run in my life. Lungs burning, headlamp bouncing, pack straps cutting into my shoulders, rocks blurring under my feet, and I hit the shelter at a dead sprint and threw myself onto the platform and pressed my back against the wall and sat there hyperventilating in the dark for a long time. There were 2 other hikers at the shelter that night, a couple from Georgia doing their through hike, and they woke up when I came in and asked if I was okay. And I said I had taken a bad fall on the descent and I was fine. And they gave me some of their trail mix and went back to sleep. And I sat with my back against the wall of that shelter until the sky turned gray in the east and the birds started up, and the world became the world again instead of whatever it had been for those 11 miles. I did not go back to that section, and I did not report it, because I have thought very carefully about what I would say and to whom I would say it, and I have no answer for either question that doesn't end with me being handed a pamphlet about anxiety disorders. But I need you to know one thing, and it is the thing that has kept me out of the woods for 3 weeks and counting, and it is this. It knew my name before it said it, which means it had heard someone say my name, which means it had been close enough to hear me talking to myself or into my recorder for notes, which is something I do constantly on solo hikes, and it had been doing that, had been close enough to listen, for long enough to learn what I was called, and I never heard it, not once, until it decided I should. I do not know how long it was with me before I knew it was there. I do not know how many miles back it started. I do not know if it is still out there or if it moves, if it has territory or if it travels, and that is the part that makes it impossible to sleep, because the AT runs from Georgia to Maine, and I have hiked pieces of it in 4 different states, and I keep looking at the maps, and I keep thinking about all the miles I walked alone and happy and completely unaware, and I wonder which of those miles I was not actually alone, and I cannot find the line, and I am starting to think there isn't one. To the person who messaged me asking for the exact GPS coordinates of the creek where I saw the print, I am not giving those out, and please stop asking. My recorder, I went back through my audio files from that day. At the 3-hour 14-minute mark, about 40 seconds of background ambience, there is a second set of footsteps very faintly audible behind mine that I did not notice when I was recording. They stop when I stop. I am not uploading the file. I don't want to listen to it again.